Today, when we think of prisons, most of us picture cramped cells that at least have electric lights, iron beds, regular meals, and laws protecting the minimum right to life. Those strict modern prisons still have a semblance of civilization. But let's try to turn back time hundreds of years back to medieval Europe. Back then, dungeons were not places for rehabilitation, but tools of suppression and mental terror. Built deep beneath fortified castles, they were damp, cold stone cellars where light never reached. Their prisoners were not only physically confined, but also had their souls crushed. Torture was not the exception, it was the rule. Starvation, darkness, chains, and haunting instruments of torture left people with only two choices: to die a slow, agonizing death, or to confess to any crime, whether real or not. So, what really lay hidden beneath the splendor of those magnificent castles? Join me as we descend the cold stone steps to discover the gruesome truth about torture customs and the lives of prisoners in the darkness of the Middle Ages. Medieval Europe from the 11th to the 15th century was a period where darkness was cast not only by war, disease, and famine, but also by the harsh rule of the nobility and the church. In magnificent castles where power and luxury reigned, there were always damp cellars, the dungeons. Dungeons were built as an integral part of defensive architecture. They were located deep underground with only a single entrance, thick walls, low ceilings, and were almost completely isolated from the outside world. Their initial purpose may have been to hold prisoners of war or rebels, but they gradually became a tool of terror and control. A vague accusation from treason, heresy, to witchcraft was all it took for anyone to be thrown into the dark pits. The laws of that time were unlike today's concept of justice. The truth was often determined by a confession, and torture was seen as a legitimate way to force people to speak. Prisoners were hung upside down, had their limbs stretched, or were confined in iron cages so tight they couldn't move. This was not just physical punishment, but also spiritual destruction, causing even the strongest to break down. Inside these dungeons, a prisoner's life revolved around darkness, hunger, and the fear of death. Rats, mold, and the stench of human waste and corpses mingled, turning the space into a realm of the dead, right in the heart of a splendid castle. Ironically, the luxury above and the brutality below coexisted within the same entity, reflecting the harsh and cruel stratification of medieval European society. In the memory of medieval Europe, the dungeon was not just a defensive structure, but a place where power was displayed through human suffering. There, every scream, every drop of blood that fell on the cold stone floor became proof of a society that used fear as a tool of governance. Instruments of torture, symbols of darkness. The accused often faced torture devices whose very names are enough to make one shudder. The rack, and where the body was stretched until bones snapped and joints were torn from the flesh. The iron chair with hundreds of red-hot spikes piercing the skin, turning the body into a living torch. Or the Iron Maiden, a standing coffin filled with sharp spikes inside, which when closed caused blood and flesh to erupt. The horrifying thing was these instruments were not just used to kill. They were designed to prolong the agony, to keep the prisoner alive, groaning and confessing. Death was not the ultimate goal, spiritual collapse was. Distorted customs and beliefs. Medieval people believed that a confession under torture was proof of the truth. If someone proclaimed their innocence, they were tormented even more, until they had no strength left to deny the charges. Women accused of witchcraft often had to undergo the trial by water, being thrown into a river with their hands and feet bound. If they sank, they were innocent but dead. If they floated, they were witches and were burned at the stake. This absurdity reflects how religious beliefs and fear turned the law into a cruel joke. There were even nobles who treated the execution or torture of prisoners as a festival. They would gather in the dungeon enjoying wine and laughing at the sight of a human being crushed. In their eyes, the pain of the weak was a form of entertainment, proof of their power. The life of a prisoner, an existence devoid of humanity. Those held in dungeons faced a life no different from hell. They were chained to stone walls, their limbs festering from rust. Food, if any, was just a few pieces of moldy bread or dirty water poured from a wooden bucket. Diseases spread quickly in the damp, rat-infested air, turning the dungeon into a mass grave. Some prisoners were held for so many years that the only light they remembered was the flickering candlelight from their last interrogation. Some went mad, screaming through the night. Others fell silent until they died. The sound of moans mixed with the dripping of water on the stone floor, creating a haunting music that never ended. The collapse of the human soul. The cruelest part was not the flowing blood or broken bones, but the way human beings were turned into insensate objects. The tortured in the end no longer knew what they were accused of. They confessed to everything from rebellion, heresy, to non-existent sins. In that moment, society had achieved its goal, turning pain into a tool of control, turning the dungeon into a place where humans ceased to be human. But this is only part of the story, because behind those dungeons was a divided society, those who supported torture to maintain power, and the desperate voices of opposition. Dungeons and barbaric forms of torture not only destroyed the fate of individuals, but also left deep scars on European history. Existing right beneath magnificent castles, they turned darkness into a tool of rule and spread widespread fear throughout the community. A society haunted by fear. In many lands, people lived in constant anxiety. They knew that a small accusation, sometimes just a neighbor's whisper, was enough for someone to disappear into the darkness forever. This pushed society into a state of mutual suspicion, eroding trust between people. The dungeon did not only imprison inmates, it imprisoned the spirit of the entire community. Moral and religious debates. However, not everyone accepted such brutality. Even in the Middle Ages, there were philosophers, scholars, and even some clergymen who asked, can truth be found through pain? Does a confession under torture have any moral value? Some bravely spoke out, but their voices were often crushed by political and church powers forces that saw torture as a necessary order to maintain power. Long-term impact on politics and law. Dungeons inadvertently shaped how European courts wielded power. It became a symbol of absolute power, where justice was distorted to serve the mighty. Yet it was this very abuse that sparked waves of resistance. As the Renaissance and Enlightenment approached, the idea of human rights began to rise. People realized that a society based on fear and torture only creates darkness and never leads to truth. The gradual fall of darkness. By the 17th and 18th centuries, with the development of science and philosophy, many European countries began to ban the use of torture. New laws were gradually established aiming for fairer and more humane trials. But the ghost of the dungeon still left its mark on the collective psyche. It became a legacy of darkness, a reminder that power, when placed entirely in the hands of one group, can easily become a tool for destroying humanity. Two sides of history. The dungeon, therefore, carries a paradox within it. To the nobility, it was a symbol of authority, a tool to protect order. But to the general populace, it was a nameless horror, a warning that justice could be distorted at any moment. It was this contrast that plunged Europe into debate for centuries, and only when the light of human rights ideology flared up did the dungeons truly begin to disappear from society. The dungeon is not just a story of the past. It is clear evidence of the cruelty of unchecked power, and also a lesson for humanity to understand that justice cannot be built on blood and screams. Today, when we look back at the dark dungeons beneath European castles, we see not only traces of stone and chains, but also a heart-wrenching lesson about power and humanity. The modern world has laws, civilized prisons, and declarations of human rights. Yet has the darkness of the Middle Ages truly disappeared? We still hear about secret prisons, concealed torture, and unjust sentences. They may not take place in cold stone cellars like in the old days, but they exist under the sophisticated guise of a new era. This shows that the dungeon is not just a physical place, it is also a symbol of the corruption that occurs when power is unchecked. When you walk through the ruins of ancient castles and look down the stone steps leading into the deep cellars, remember that place once echoed with human screams and once witnessed the collapse of justice. And the unanswered question remains, have we, with all our modern civilization, truly escaped that darkness? Or are we just creating more sophisticated prisons for ourselves? Thank you for joining me on this journey down the dark corridors of history. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to continue exploring other mysteries of the past.